Hey, everybody. We are talking with Gilbert King. It's funny because listening to the interview, you would think you were a lawyer, but you're actually a podcaster, a producer, a writer, and a passionate advocate for justice.
Yes.
It's kind of what came across during the interview for me. And you and Laura had an amazing conversation about the subject matter of your podcast called Bone Valley, which now I'm going to go download some episodes and listen to it. Sounds perfect.
You're
Bone
going to love
Valley.
it, hon.
I know, I can tell. Usually I just have Laura tell me everything she's either reading or listening to.
Yeah.
I know how that works.
But real quick, we'll just go into the background. In 1980, I guess, Leo Schofield was arrested for the murder of his then wife, Michelle.
I think it's 87.
Yeah, 87.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he is now serving a life sentence. In 2018, a judge Scott Cupp asked you to take a look at this case because you were a passionate writer of injustice, civil rights, the death penalty, and he played with your curiosity a little bit, the judge.
He really did, yeah.
We discovered in the conversation.
Yeah.
And now you have become very acquainted with Leo and his case. And it's really interesting because for me, and I'll shut up here in just a second, but for me, when I hear about these cases that have been overturned so many times, that appeals have been denied, I just automatically, I think, out of the ease and comfort of being human, I think, like he must be guilty,
Right.
But for you had an opposite reaction. And can you tell us a little bit about how you got turned on to this case by Judge Cupp, and then we'll
yeah.
I mean, where we are today.
Once I finally, got his card and I called him because I was really curious, like, what is this judge going to say about, this inmate, and he's innocent? Like, it just seems strange for a judge to be telling me this. But, he was, extraordinarily familiar with the case. And I remember there was one point I can tell you, he said to me something like, they railroaded him. And I know exactly how they did it because he used to be a prosecutor and he knew all the little things to look for. And so he was guiding me a lot. And so he became somebody that I could really lean on because he knew the case so well. And, he's not supposed to be doing this. There's these judicial canons in the state of Florida that, they're supposed to, protect the sanctity of the courts by not having judges comment about other cases. And, but like his opinion is like, well, I'm fighting for justice. I know I'm right here. And there's an innocent man in prison. And that sort of took precedent to the judicial canons. And he said, I'm willing to risk it. I'm willing to do this for you. And tell you everything. And, I think we start the whole podcast out with just that conversation. Like, I'm not supposed to be doing this. He says, like he could lose everything. He could be disbarred. He could be kicked off the bench. So he's putting himself at risk.
That must be so difficult for a judge who cannot, we recently had a judge on the show and she reminded us that she doesn't decide innocence or guilt. She simply decides what the sentence is. And so to watch injustice and to know that things, it's like watching a team cheat or something. You can't stand up and say, I know what's happening, but for somebody to step aside for you, to you and say, hey, I'd like you to look at this. And then you came to understand this gentleman, Leo, and you, like Laura said in the podcast, you might have fallen in love with his character and his morality, even with everything that's been thrown at him that's so negative.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, like was really resistant to, like trying not to get too close to him. I didn't want to give him any hope. Every once in a while he'd talk about hope. I'm like, I don't want to hear about hope because I don't want to be that. I don't want that on me. Yeah. There's so much of it is out of my hands. And I just know how the post-conviction world is. It's just impossible to get these cases overturned unless there's like really obvious DNA evidence for some reason. That seems to be more like legitimate in the eyes of the court. Well, fingerprints actually match people to crime scenes too, and they can be just as powerful as DNA. But so to all of a sudden say, well, it's not, there's no DNA that can exonerate him. It's not a real innocence claim. I mean, I never quite understood that. But yeah, I was reluctant to get involved and put my heart into it because I didn't want to I didn't want to be living and dying every day the way Leo and his family are living and dying with every judgment and every decision. It's just a lot to carry. And I didn't want to put something in his head that like, yeah, once the story comes out, it'll just be, a few days and it'll be out, like I don't want to do that. So yeah, I know it's very difficult.
Well, I mean, a couple of things you talked about that are so convincing are that no fingerprints were found in the car that Michelle was transported in, except for the fingerprints of the confessed killer, who is also in prison for other charges. It's remarkable, the information that you found. That is. Can you give us a little bit of your understanding of why is the system working against Leo? Why Leo? I know that Leo's from Brooklyn. He was convicted in Florida. He doesn't seem to fit into the culture quite, as comfortably as people would like. But why is the system working against Leo?
No, I mean, I think there is something to what you say. Like he's from like New England, really, like the outside of Boston. So he got this thick accent. It doesn't really sound like he belongs down there. And, I think the prosecution comes in and looks at these kind of guys, and they're living in this section of Lakeland called Cumbie, which is, it's a high crime area, mostly white. And they just look at them. They call them Cumbie critters. Wow. Even the sheriff says, I'm a Cumbie critter myself. He grew up in that area. But so there's definitely this disparaging way that they have of looking at this low income white people that live in this area, in a lot of these trailer parks. So like that, it's just like, I think that it's just the way that law enforcement works. Like those are the troublemakers in the area, right? Like it's always the low income areas that are always going to be the troublemakers, right? According to law enforcement. And so, they know he's got, rock and roll, hard rock and roll. I think in the early stages of this trial, you started to see it go in a little bit over to the satanic panic area. Like you'd heard certain witnesses saying, when Leo would get mad, his eyes would turn bright red like the devil. And like, where the hell is this going? Unfortunately, that never made it into the case, but that was making it into a lot of cases at the time in the 80s and early 90s. So yeah, it's just like this one area of Florida, Central Florida, that people just don't really know what to think of. It's not the surf and sand. It's just kind of this really rural, deep South area that's not too far from Orlando, and people don't really quite know how to look at it. But it's it's industrious. Phosphate, cattle, and oranges were the main business there.
Wow. And looking at a case like this and seeing what mistakes were made and how people were railroaded and like that is exposing a lot of broken parts of the system as well. Is that true? Like
yeah.
We go back and look at this and we say the prosecutor here and the judge in this case or whatever, there are certain pieces that probably don't want to be exposed even at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think the main reason why this case is running into the kind of resistance to fix it is because the prosecutor who prosecuted Leo, he also prosecuted Jeremy Scott and tried to send him to the electric chair.
And just so Jeremy Scott is the confessed killer of Leo's wife. So
right
there you go.
Right. So he's got a vested interest in protecting his conviction. And he's also doing these, interviews with Jeremy Scott without witnesses, without tape recordings. And it does look like they came to some kind of deal. Like you stick to your story about just being a car stereo thief and maybe I'll help you out with your parole somewhere down the line. For a man who's spending the rest of his life in prison, he doesn't know any better. The prosecutor's offering him a deal. He doesn't know any better. He doesn't have a lawyer there with him.
I mean, and even for me, the amount of compassion and empathy that you express for Jeremy Scott was pretty impressive, and I mean, it gave me a sense of understanding of why he's here. With that, though, now we're almost 35 years after this case has initially been initiated. There is some news that you wanted to pass on, possibly, honey. Did you know? Did you want to tee that up?
This is what we talked about yesterday, but I didn't know.
Right.
When we ended the podcast, what the news was. But you are Gilbert. You're willing to share because the bonus episode where you've revealed this news has already dropped as we're listening. So tell us what's going on.
Right. So, interestingly enough, I think Judge Cupp started seeing the reaction, and I think he was kind of disappointed that like nobody filed a complaint against him, that he wasn't reported for speaking out about this case. And I think he really just said, I'm not pulling my weight. And so he told me that he has decided to resign from the bench in order to go back to Leo's team and to represent Leo. And so 2 weeks ago, we drove out to Hardy Prison for Judge Cupp to see Leo, to have a visit with him for the first time in like a dozen years. And so Kelsey and I drove him out there and we waited for him. He was in there for like 5 hours. And they just went over the past and just hugged. We got to see him as they were saying goodbye through the fence, about 60 yards away. They kind of hugged goodbye, and then Leo just walked over to the fence and waved to us through the fence. It was really bittersweet to be that close to him and not be able to visit with him that day. But yeah, so Judge Cupp is coming back onto the team, and he's got some plans, but these two were, like, as they said, we were in the boat together. And when that boat started sinking, it was just me and Scott Cupp, bailing it with buckets. And here we are back in the boat again. So it's going to be an interesting development. And, I think Judge Cupp brings a lot of passion and a lot of credibility to this case. And so I'm really excited to see what happens for Leo.
Well, we are, I am thoroughly impressed with the work you're doing. And I think there's a strong recognition of injustice in all of us as human beings. And it's just so cool that you've decided to take the role as somebody who seeks out justice. And you seem very situated, like your life, the way you see things in the world, the way you express the clarity that you do seems to be you could have been a lawyer.
I don't know about that. Would have had to pass that LSAT.
Your information gathering and explanation is really sound. And we just really admire the work you're doing, and we're feel really lucky to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. That's really nice of you to say. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Gilbert.
My pleasure. You guys are great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And please listen to Gilbert's podcast, Bone Valley, which you'll find in the show notes of this episode. You just click on the link. It'll take you straight in, and you can do what I did and just listen to that for like 9 days straight.
A lot of fun.
Gilbert, thank you.